Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who'll share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Hello and welcome back to another episode of American Medieval. Every week I say we are honored and pleased to have our guest on, but today it is especially true because I am pleased to welcome Rachel Gabriele, no relation. Actually, that's not true. Rachel Gabriele is, of course, my wife. But more than that, and more importantly than that, she serves in the Provost office at Virginia Tech, leading policy and administrative initiatives related to faculty affairs. But disciplinarily, Rachel is interested in how the built environment influences culture, particularly in urban and campus settings. Her PhD focused on the built environment in Detroit after recent redevelopment efforts. And we are going to talk about kind of neo-medieval Detroit. Rachel, my beloved, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Finally.
Finally. I know we've been talking about this for so long, and I cannot say how awkward this is right now that we are sitting in the same house in different rooms, and I am interviewing you. Not just the fact that I am interviewing you, but we're going to roll with this and we're going to make it work because we're actually working on a project together that we're going to present at a conference coming up in the fall, and that's, I think, what the primary focus of our conversation will be. Before we get to that, though, I feel compelled to start with a time machine question because, although you're not a medievalist, bless, though we do have to kind of, honor the traditions of American Medieval dating back all these 6 months or however long we've been recording now. So my question for you, if you will indulge me, is that let's imagine for a moment that we have a time machine. And that time machine is single use and there and back, so you don't have to stay anywhere. You get to come back to the present. But the time machine is used, kind of with the caveat that you have to go back and tell a younger version of yourself that someday you will be married to a medievalist who also has a podcast. How does a younger you respond to that news?
Ooh. All right. So I think the answer depends on the age that we hit me at.
Okay.
Whether I was in the land of watching Home Improvement, if you recall that show, or if I was in my mad about you phase. Now, I would say if I were in my mad about you phase, I would, A, have no idea what a podcast was, but B, now, if you said medieval history professor, that translates really well to Paul Reiser and the nerdy New York City kind of lifestyle. So that would be on board.
On board. Okay. I was a little worried because I saw where you were going, am I thinking am I Tim Allen or am I Paul Reiser? And I'm happy that I'm more Paul Reiser than Tim Allen.
Just saying, yeah.
So thank you for that. But that aside, all right, let me rephrase that question because, I wanted to try to dispel the awkwardness and it's not really working, I have to say, but we're going to get there. So let's do the time machine question one more time and ask again, instead of going back and talking about kind of me, which, it is my podcast, so I get to talk about me in this space. I think that's entirely fair. Well, at least to me, because again, I host the podcast. But let's go back to the time machine thing and ask again, instead of asking about that, if you had to go back and talk to yourself about that, you would have completed a PhD, become kind of an urban geographer as you kind of, think about yourself, and you were working on Detroit specifically related to issues of race and policy and history and things like that. Would that have surprised you going back to kind of that same period, like early college or even like high school or something like that?
So I think on the one hand, it would surprise me because I think growing up, I had this in my mind in high school, going into college. I wanted to be an international business person.
Okay.
Whatever that means, international business person. And I think that stemmed from an interest in A, making money, but B, traveling, right? Being able to see, you would order all those catalogs for all the different countries. They used to send you tourism catalogs and I would order every single one. So I think that's where those things came from. If I look back now, at my interests, and as a child and growing up, I could see pretty clearly a way that I could get to where I am now
Mm-hmm.
in a way that I never would have imagined then. So, always fascinated with buildings and architecture and spaces. Born in Michigan, have a some sort of genetic tie to Detroit. So, those make sense to me. The interest and curiosity, the intellectual curiosity, that makes sense that I would continue to want to pursue my education. Super awkward. I will go there and don't cry.
Oh, I'm
But
excited about this.
I will say that a lot of that furthering of my education was because I was with you.
Hmm.
And not only that you were doing that, and so I was watching it happen and seeing that it was possible, but that you encouraged me and challenged me to do that and had confidence that I could do that. So just putting that out there.
This is probably our most wholesome podcast episode ever. So, and it will only go from there. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think that, I've had people actually mention to me in real life, which is weird that people actually listen to the podcast and like comment on the podcast when they see me in real life or email me or something like that. But about how that time machine question really gets them to think about their own career paths and just the weird kind of incidents or serendipitous moments that kind of transform the way that they think about a project or the possibility of something. Because, when I started college, like I understood like kind of what a teacher was. I understood kind of what a professor was, but I didn't know like what that meant kind of as a career path or anything like that. And, what I'm hearing from you too, and which is very common, I think, with a lot of the people who respond to this is that it's just some moment, some person that puts that spark in their head, like, hey, you could do this. Like, you could continue this. You could pursue that kind of passion, right? And I think that's what a university kind of at its best can do, and you work in administration within a university too, but you work with faculty so much and that you're able to kind of pursue these kinds of things. So I would love to think it's just kind of me, but your interests, as you said, kind of blending both policy, which you work on at the university level, but also urban spaces, but also kind of an academic scholarly perspective on that. It's kind of a synthesis of all these kind of weird things that have brought you to the place that you are, right?
Mm-hmm. And not to give you all the credit either.
Please don't.
I will recall that it was 2007 that I decided to audit a class at Virginia Tech because we were here, and again, intellectual curiosity and all that. And I audited an art history class on Bosch and Bruegel, which was fascinating, just Bosch and banana pants. And so, but that professor had on some paper I'd written, and this is 8 years after I graduated from undergraduate with a degree in finance and a minor in art history, but business major. Really took an interest and gave really thoughtful comments, and in one of those comments said, "Hey, you should think about going back to school. Like you should think about getting a PhD."
Mm-hmm.
And so that, I know you love me. And so, of course, everything I do is this magical and perfect. But here's someone who doesn't know me who's saying that as well. So having those two pieces together, I think really tipped the scales to be thinking about that.
Yeah, it's just those little nudges. But I want to go back to something you said for a moment, because I think this is one of those kind of new sentences that you see kind of on Reddit every once in a while. Bosch's banana pants, which is an absolutely true statement if anybody has looked at Hieronymus Bosch's paintings. But I don't think like that very simple statement has ever been uttered before. So I want to highlight that for our listeners.
Let's make this a thing.
It's but Bosch's banana pants. That's right.
Yep.
So please, Met, give me a call, and we'll just put that under all of his paintings.
Mm-hmm.
We'll actually give Rachel a call, I guess, not me.
And I'll say too that I talk to a lot of faculty, and listening to your podcast, you hear so often that this winding road, or I have no idea how I got here. This is not where I expected to be. My path was different, but underneath all that are some clues for everyone that, of course, you're going to end up where you are.
Yeah.
And it may not be that, like you said, that what your career path is, but your interests as a child and interest writ large, not, oh, I love medieval cathedrals, so therefore, but, this tiniest little thing of that smell of incense in a church always spoke to me as a child. Things like that, they're clues that show, of course, you're going to end up where you are right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, not necessarily that, it's fated that it would happen because, lots of other things could have intervened, but at the same time, like there are kind of, proximate, immediate causes in which cause you to pursue the career that you do, but there's also kind of long-term interests. There's always something kind of back there that connects you oftentimes. And so I want to go back, kind of transition a little bit to Detroit, right? Because you said, you make a joke, and I've heard you make this, and other, people from Michigan kind of make that. Like there's something about Detroit that kind of calls you, something like that. But I want to kind of push past that because your particular interest in kind of built environment, culture, stories, and that particular city, like how did that come together for you?
I think it came through, I don't know how to phrase it, like organized trauma, structured trauma. I ran a marathon, my first and only marathon through Detroit. And I was, interested in the city just out of curiosity. This was in 2011. So this was around the time that Detroit was, the narrative around Detroit was becoming the blighted,
ruin porn, right?
empty, ruin. Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
In that phase. And so I think I was tuned into that and wanted to run a marathon and decided I wanted to do it in Detroit. Detroit's also pretty flat, so that definitely influenced it. And
Absolutely.
And it is one of the only, if not the only, marathon that runs internationally. So we got to run into Canada briefly and back around. But for 26 miles, as you are alone and running, and in 2011, the technology of like iPods and whatnot was limited. So I probably had maybe 20 songs that I had listened to over and over again. You spend a lot of time paying attention to your surroundings. And again, that because of the suffering or the difficulty of a marathon, it is etched into your brain in a way that just walking through or driving around. And so spend a lot of time thinking about the different spaces. As a marathon, they try to get you into a lot of different areas and neighborhoods. And so I think it was after that really it solidified my interest in especially the built environment and like what's happening here. And again, 2012 and the bankruptcy just, amped that up a lot. So that's the origins.
Yeah. So you got to see kind of a lot of the different parts of the city. And I'm kind of getting from you, but you haven't said this, so please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the image that you kind of had in Detroit, this kind of ruin porn idea, did not match in some ways what you were seeing, or did match and you were kind of curious about what you were seeing?
There's a little of both. So I think the interest of the city in having a marathon is that they're not going to send you through the parts that don't look nice.
Sure,
right?
Of course, yeah.
That said, for that amount of distance, they can't just keep you in the okay areas. And so I think that was really the most telling is running through Corktown, which is an area of Detroit that has stayed stable through the bankruptcy and out of it. I mean, it's obviously it's doing better now, but it wasn't derelict. It wasn't empty. There weren't abandoned buildings. So that's an area that you run through and, and the city wants you to see. But then you're running through Brush Park, which is where all the Mies van der Rohe townhouses are, which is beautiful. And then just past that, prairie. You run into emptiness and you see where these narratives are coming from. You see the abandoned houses, some crumbling, some just boarded windows, some just grass growing up, and then empty lots where because this is a city, there should have been a building and there isn't. We ran near Michigan Central Station at the time, was abandoned and covered in graffiti and, that sort of thing. So then ran through also Indian Village, which is really upscale housing. I think Jack White of the White Stripes lived there.
Sounds great. Yeah,
So
I believe you.
fancy houses. They were giving us snacks on the street. And, again, we ran the spectrum of Detroit in that marathon. And so saw both where the narrative of blight was coming from, but also saw that that wasn't the whole story. And I think that's what you were maybe getting at, is that disconnect of what's actually going on here when, yeah, I see what they're saying over here, but what about this other stuff that's going on too?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that's really interesting about Detroit, as you and I have had kind of conversations about this in the past, is that there's kind of a paradox. Is I want to talk about kind of the history and like kind of, if listeners aren't kind of familiar with that a little bit. But before that is like the geography of it is really curious to me in that it is a very large city, but kind of by square miles. But at the same time, like the neighborhoods that you're talking about are not terribly far from one another. Like you can run or you can walk, kind of across these things. And because they are very well connected because of cars and Detroit and stuff like that. So that seems to be really interesting as well as like Indian Village and, downtown and Corktown. Like it's not hugely difficult to kind of get between them as kind of the crow flies, but they can be very, very different from one another, which is, lots of neighborhoods and cities, of course, are very different from one another. But Detroit seems to have something kind of unique about the way that it's been redeveloped or the way that it's kind of been impacted by. And that really strikes something. And that brings me to kind of to that history is that I was wondering, can you talk a little bit too about like these neighborhoods and kind of redevelopment, because there was that narrative of kind of decline and then resurgence and stuff like that. And like, how does that play into the built environment in these neighborhoods that you're particularly interested in?
That's a really big question, Matt.
I like the big questions on my podcast. So.
Yeah, and I, not to spend the hour delving into the whole history of Detroit, but really high level, we can talk about getting back to the early 1900s and industrialization and the Great Migration, which is folks who were, newly freed slaves living in the South, coming up into the Rust Belt and starting new lives. And Detroit was a great recipient of that migration. And so think about that time where the Ford and General Motors, the auto industry was really building in Detroit. Detroit was the epicenter of that. Lots of jobs, and here's a lot of people looking for opportunity. So I think that's when the demographics of the city really started shifting. So you have that, and then we get to the 40s, and we start seeing the tension between Black and white residents of Detroit. And the 40s was the first kind of conflict, the first race riot, as it were. And from there, redlining and freeways that were destroying Black neighborhoods, just so much anti-Black initiatives happening, policies in the city trying to push back against these newcomers, as it were, who've now been there for decades. And then, hopefully we're all at least marginally familiar with the 1967 and the rebellion and the race riots in Detroit and the damage that did. Now, in all this space, I will say the built environment is a key player in all of this. So, for example, the freeways. So Detroit is the auto industry. The roads there, just the boulevards, feel dangerous to cross. And you've been there, 7-lane streets. This is not a pedestrian friendly city. And in the 40s and 50s, and 60s, they were doing freeway development, right? How can we get more cars on the road? And so crafted the narrative, and this is tied up with the racism of the city, is let's look for blighted neighborhoods that we can destroy to make room for the freeways. And conveniently, those blighted neighborhoods were primarily Black neighborhoods. Black Bottom being the most famous of them, hugely successful Black community that businesses and community leaders and just so well established, blighted, destroyed for a freeway.
Yeah. what you're saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, is kind of conscious policy decisions which kind of led to the destruction, which, were going on, of course, in other cities as well, but one that was particularly kind of acute because of the prevalence of cars. Right, the usage of cars and the way that these new kind of avenues, boulevards, as you call them, like kind of divide up the city, and then the freeways, looking for excuses in order to further exclude Black Americans from these communities, separate them from their prosperity, and sometimes destroying actually like very prosperous communities kind of in the process. Again, unfortunately, a theme in American history, and then followed by, of course, white flight, right, in the kind of 60s and 70s. So it's interesting too, right, is that the narrative of kind of the destruction of Detroit only starts kind of when white people leave the city.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, in the 60s and 70s. And then so can you bring us up kind of more current day? Because Detroit had this kind of ruin porn, like the abandoned kind of downtowns and these areas literally sometimes kind of actually turning back into kind of prairie because of the destruction of houses and stuff like that. And now Detroit seems to be kind of on the way back, or at least it's telling a story of itself on the way back. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think white flight was really the point at which the city started to decline, right? And so you have a huge decline in population over a period of time. And as you already noted, Detroit is a huge city. It's upwards of 140 square miles. It's a very large city, very spread out, tons of neighborhoods. And so when you have population leaving, they're not leaving all from one neighborhood. They're leaving in pockets all over the city. And so what's happening then, if you think infrastructure wise, is you have garbage men and light posts and bus stops and things like that have to navigate complete emptiness to get to something that's farther away. And so they start cutting down on those services, or those services become harder to get in some of the neighborhoods. And so that further decline, causes decline to neighborhoods. And then we get to the point of 2012, and the city declares bankruptcy, essentially. And they, don't have enough money for these services. At the time, there was a huge threat to the pensions of city workers, which was saved, thankfully, and protected through the bankruptcy. But, and this is back into that lens of racist policies, is the state put in an emergency manager to run the city. You can't be trusted to manage your city. So we're going to send someone in who does that, and caused great damage to, again, infrastructure and trying to right size without regard for communities, etc. So that all happened in 2011-12, that period. And for a few years, they started coming out of it in 2015, I will say. And so what we're seeing in the last decade is a rebirth, right? So if we subscribe to the narrative that Detroit was dead and ruined, then now there's a narrative of it coming back. And so what we have to interrogate around that coming back, though, is for who and by who. And this is where we start seeing some prospectors. I'll reference Rebecca Kinney's book, Beautiful Wasteland, as talking about this idea of Detroit as a frontier, the Wild West. And so you have these white saviors who come in and say, oh, I'm going to come and save Detroit. And that's everyone from big developers to individuals who see, oh, you can buy a house in Detroit for like $2,000. Like, I want to go and start a new life in this blank canvas. And the reality is that the population of Detroit was still 600,000. There are people there, and they're in neighborhoods and communities. And so they didn't necessarily like the narrative that it was empty and a free for all, here for the taking. And so that's been the last 10 years, that narrative of who is the city for, and who gets to rebuild this city.
And that question about kind of who the city is for is really interesting because, one of the things that your research talks about, right, is it's these developers who are coming in, they're not kind of investing in areas kind of willy-nilly, right? Like it seems like they're investing in certain areas or certain neighborhoods. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I've talked to you about this, and maybe this is where we start getting a little medieval.
This is what we call a segue. Yes.
So, a couple of, in that vein of white saviors or coming in and saving this dead city, there were a couple of big real estate investors who started buying up property in the city at its lowest and then ultimately reshaping it in their image, as it were. I'll highlight just a couple of them. Dan Gilbert, who has bought tons of properties in the downtown area of Detroit and has redeveloped a ton of those buildings. The most recent, the Hudson's, they tore down the old Hudson's department store, built this huge skyscraper that's going to have, mixed use offices and workspaces and fancy apartments and all that, but really focused in the downtown to the point where you could almost draw like a border around Gilbertville,
Yeah.
as it were. And what's interesting about that, huge city, lots of neighborhoods, lots of primarily Black neighborhoods. Downtown, not one of those. Has historically been majority white and also a commercial center. So the argument is that they're focusing here sort of in the trickle down economics kind of realm of if we invest here, then that will ultimately help the neighborhoods, is how they refer to outside of the downtown, the neighborhoods. So if we revitalize downtown first, then we'll be able to benefit the neighborhoods. So that's Gilbert and that's downtown. And it's interesting because these are all now privately owned buildings. He has his own security. There are cameras, so this concepts of surveillance in these areas, fascinating. And then you go a little bit north of Gilbertville and you cross the freeway and you get to what is now being called Midtown Detroit. And that is Mike Ilitch and his family who own Little Caesars. And I was reading an article recently, and they used a great term for what he did in Midtown, which is dereliction by design. And so essentially what happened is in the late 90s, early 2000s, as the city's declining, he bought up a ton of property in that Midtown area and then left it there to rot. And drove property values down. This is a terrible place. No one wants to live here because he owns it all and he's letting it fall to pieces. And then once they come out of bankruptcy and things start looking up, then boom, he pitches a redevelopment of this whole area, the Little Caesars Arena, and doesn't have any competition because it's this dead space that he's bought. And he also gets the benefit of the city's reinvestment in redevelopment of it.
Oh, yeah.
So hundreds of millions of dollars in tax breaks and public support for the arena and the surrounding area. So he becomes a hero of his own making, as it were. So that's, Ilitch Town, as it were, is. And there's not a lot of overlap. So these are little city states almost that are being created.
Yeah, and I think that's where kind of our connection comes, right? Because we had on the podcast very recently, by the time this episode will air, Ada Koskowski to talk about kind of what I like to call kind of the medieval F word, feudalism, right? The idea of kind of medieval political, economic, and kind of cultural structures, and how feudalism itself as a kind of an umbrella term doesn't work, but how we can talk about, like in the European Middle Ages, this overlapping network of obligations that extend beyond, just politics to include economics and culture, in which people have kind of spheres of influence, which are porous, so you can kind of move beyond them in some ways, but at the other times there are borders between them. So, like what Gilbert and Ilitch have done, and it's not a perfect analogy, but they've created kind of little fiefdoms for themselves in which they operate kind of, as you said, like Dan Gilbert has his own private security, he has his own kind of thing that operates parallel to, but also separate from, like the local police. police or the city police, and then you have the state kind of on top of that, as well as city government. And so there's all these kind of really complicated structures in which, kind of understanding something about the Middle Ages, I think can kind of help us get a better sense of kind of what's going on here. And it extends not just kind of in these smaller areas, but like you've mentioned just a couple, like Mike Ilitch and Young Gilbert, but there's also kind of Ford, which is over kind of in Corktown, and then other ones that are elsewhere as well, right? And that brings us to kind of the research I think that we're doing, because in the middle of all of this is a university.
Mm-hmm.
That operates both within and outside all of these types of things. The large public university is a state-run university, Wayne State University, which is in Midtown Detroit. Pale Blue Pod is an astronomy podcast for people who are overwhelmed by the universe, but still want to be its friend. Astrophysicist Dr. Moya McTeer and her best friend Constar demystify space one topic at a time, with clear eyes, full hearts. Learn about space with open eyes and open arms and a good sense of humor. The vast cosmos will seem, by the end of every episode, just a bit more intimate and knowable. New episodes every Monday. Can you tell us just a little bit of the background kind of about Wayne State and kind of the idea that we had about what we're calling kind of a neomedieval ecosystem in relation to this public urban university in Detroit?
Yeah, and I am not going to promise to have even a great knowledge of the history of Wayne State, but I can talk about how we've been talking about it more recently. And I'll go back a little bit to say, so Wayne State University is centered just north of Ilitchtown, just north of Midtown in Detroit. One of the things that university, it's a public institution, that Wayne State in the 60s started to try to expand in a very similar way to what we saw Ilitch and Gilbert do, which is, and the freeways more specifically, is to say, what can we identify as blight and then start buying up to expand the university? And they got a little ways, and that's probably a lot of the footprint that we see today, but they also got stopped from doing more. So the footprint of Wayne State is really, and again, I think this is a particular interest, is a campus in a city like this, where I think you used a great term, porous, right? They're not clear borders. There's not walls around these spaces. They are porous borders and edges, but they are still an entity in and of themselves within an urban environment. And so I think the campus in an urban space is fascinating. I do want to highlight a bit of a connection. Speaking of porousness between Ilitch and then Wayne State, is that just, I don't know, in the last decade, Mike Ilitch donated a huge amount of money to Wayne State to build a business school. There's now the Ilitch School of Business. That building kind of sits between Ilitchtown and Wayne State University. And so it serves as sort of a bridge. It demonstrates both Ilitch's interest in getting some tax credits and, getting his name on something, but also tying himself to this university and this other entity that's right next door. And then it shows Wayne State's interest in playing with other players as they see the benefit of doing that, while still not paying taxes in the same way, getting some of those benefits. So kind of dipping in and out of city benefits and politics as they wish, to put it very, that sounds very Machiavellian, but
I mean, it's not Machiavellian too, because the other player too, which of course we need to pay attention to, is the state, right? Because Wayne State now is a public university run by the state of Michigan, or at least responsible to the state of Michigan. But it didn't always, if I'm remembering correctly, like it started with a more city focus. Like it was run, in fact, by, I think there was the board of trustees was appointed by the mayor. And then when they did the kind of massive expansion, that kind of shifted it to the state. And there was a state law that was passed that kind of incorporated it into the state system. But at the same time, like they still have to live with in the city. And this is where, the analogy, I think, to the Middle Ages really kind of helps us, because the way that we've been talking about it as if the university is kind of like a medieval monastery, in which it is both outside but also within these different jurisdictions. And it deals with all these competing jurisdictions kind of around them, some of them private, some of them public. Because the way that monasteries oftentimes functioned in the Middle Ages, especially kind of in the Central European Middle Ages, from, say, like 900 to about 1200, and then kind of even beyond that sometimes as well, is that they could be established by local interests, starting as kind of a city college or something like that. But then when the king got interested in a particular monastery, either because it was strategic for him or because it had a certain reputation for sanctity or something like that, he would offer grants to take that monastery under his particular protection in order to kind of remove it from local jurisdiction to give it kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of national or kind of royal protection. But it would still, at the same time, benefit from local competing lords who would donate to that monastery in order to get specific types of benefits, sometimes economic, but oftentimes kind of cultural and religious as well, and which would expand and allow that monastery kind of to expand its scope and its sphere of influence. And that seems to me kind of the way that you're describing what's happening kind of at Wayne State, right? Is that the city has a vested interest. The monastery itself has its own interests, like is trying to kind of expand, and then is kind of benefiting from the reputation of itself as a university from local investors or local feudal lords like Mike Ilitch and, his kind of partners who are giving this, not just the business school, but like the land that the business school sits on in order for it to expand its kind of footprint.
Yep. And I'll say, and this gets maybe into, and I'd be curious to hear from the monastery standpoint, one of the big controversies with this donation of the business school to Wayne State was that the fund agreement, which was not transparently shared, it had to be FOIA'd.
Shocking.
Yeah. It had stipulations that gave the donors control over reviewing curriculum for the business school.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so the argument against that is, the next line says, but ultimately the response, the university controls the curriculum. But just really mind blowing that they would have a review of the curriculum. So I'm be curious with monasteries if there's something like that as well. I'm not even going to pretend to go there, but maybe you could go there.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously something, if anybody just followed kind of the politics of higher education, this is a worrying trend, right? Especially over the last, 20-something years or something like that. Private donors who want control of faculty who are hired to teach in certain areas, or literally the specific courses that are being taught. This is in the news kind of as we're recording this right now in the state of Iowa, this new Center for Intellectual Freedom, which has mandated courses by the states and all sorts of stuff going on. Anyway, back to the medieval analogy, though, is like, yeah, that actually kind of does work in the Middle Ages, because oftentimes what would happen is that when kings or any sort of noblemen, or even in the later Middle Ages, wealthy merchants would make a donation to the monastery, it would come with stipulations that we are giving you this land or this money or these cows sometimes, or this grain or this field, or these serfs who will work your land, on the condition that you pray for our souls, that you add to your religious practice a prayer for me, the donor, and my family, so that your prayers will be efficacious in helping us kind of get to heaven. I'm doing a pious act. I'm giving you this thing, and in return, I am getting something back. So that kind of reciprocity is oftentimes, maybe does have kind of a medieval analogy. What's kind of interesting, and this is getting into the weeds a little bit, is that in the Middle Ages, those donations are always contingent. They often exist only for the length of time of the donor's life. So it would need to be renegotiated in subsequent generations. The thing about these modern donor relations, is my understanding, is like, this is in perpetuity. They will establish a group that will review kind of curriculum permanently. If I were to give, $2 million to Virginia Tech, like, my children cannot revoke that, at some point. But whereas in a medieval monastery, there was always a site or chance for renegotiation if things changed. And it gave both the donor, but also the monastery itself, like a little bit more control about like what they were accepting and the conditions that were kind of attached to it.
It's interesting if you think about campuses and the naming of buildings too, is we speak in general of in perpetuity, but if a building falls down, for example, or, a new building gets built, that doesn't preserve the name of that former building. Like,
No,
it's
that's
in
true.
perpetuity until the
Yeah.
building goes away.
Or until it turns out that he was a Klan leader or something
Well,
like
there
that.
you go.
So, yeah.
So there are limitations to that. I will say, I think with this donor agreement for the Illich School of Business, there is a line about no matter where that school, the business school is, like building wise, it's always going to be called the Illich.
Oh.
Which you could go into a full conspiracy theory and say, oh, that's really interesting because that means at some point they can reclaim this land, right? And put the business school somewhere and say, like, oh, yeah, you have to put that somewhere else. We're taking this land back, but still get the benefit of it being called the Illich School of Business,
Yeah. It's an interesting question, too, about kind of what is the school? Is it the building or is it the set of courses and curricula and faculty and students that are there? And this donation seems to be saying it is not the building. The building is part of it, but it exists kind of beyond that as well. But that's also, too, like kind of a medieval analogy in some ways, because I mean, the university itself, as I have written with my colleague and friend David Perry in The Bright Ages, like universities are a medieval invention, right? And it started out not as a set of buildings, but as a collection of faculty and students who are doing a specific type of thing. And I think that's kind of the other thing, too, which goes back to kind of what we were talking about way back when at the beginning of our conversation, is about the interest in the stories that we tell about the built environment, right? Because a university, Wayne State in this particular case, right, is that it's trying to tell a particular story about what this business school is, but what it itself is within this urban environment. And it's using donations, but also its ability to play off city and state and private interests in its own way in order to construct its own story too, right? Because we've been talking in some ways about it being kind of a passive thing, like things happen to Wayne State, but that's not true. Like, and you kind of pointed out a little bit about that, about expansion, for example, in the 1960s. Very cynically buying up local properties and things of that nature. So, does that seem to kind of resonate with the research that you've been doing? Because this is a very long-winded way, a podcasty way, if you will, of getting to like how do stories factor in here? Because we are telling a story about things, but what are the other stories that Wayne State or a public university would be telling about itself as it exists in this weird kind of space between different policy and economic and political structures?
Well, and I would say, I would put that very, very presently to say, I think there's a lot of challenge in that right now, in that universities, higher ed, and I'm just going to speak very generally.
Sure.
Higher ed feels threatened, under threat right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so what does that do to opportunities that present themselves for a university to be strategic about how they take advantage of or don't take advantage of said opportunity? So I don't know the inner workings of Wayne State University, but if you're struggling, maybe you have enrollment challenges, this is common in a lot of universities right now, and you have a big donor who comes in and wants to give you something. Whether you have a strategic plan or a narrative about what you want to be, it's really tempting to take a gift when you are offered it. And so then you become a little more reactive than proactive. So, and I think in this current more desperate environment, more and more of that might happen. And so all that to say, whatever story a university might want to tell about itself may shift because of the things it takes advantage of that are counter to the story it wants it to tell about itself. If you had a really great liberal arts college and they got some huge STEM donor who wants to build them an engineering school and they're desperate and they're going to say yes, what does that do to their story about being this strong liberal arts college? I think and this gets a little into my other research about narratives and stories, is there are stories that generate from the people who are experiencing these spaces. So we're sitting outside and we're reading articles and we're reading, Chronicle of Higher Ed or Inside Higher Ed, and we're sitting back and saying, oh, this deal that Wayne State made is such and such. If you went to campus and started looking at how people are engaging in those buildings, maybe that building is an incredible space where students and faculty are spending time together. And, we don't know that sitting here. And that was really the basis of my research in Detroit, was looking at the stories that are being told about redevelopment in the city, about the successes of that, about especially our argument that there are two Detroits, and these redevelopment efforts are trying to make one Detroit. So black and white, the Detroiters and the newcomers, all that, we're all going to be one big happy family. And then looking at that, how it's enacted in real time. So not interviewing people, but sitting in spaces and seeing how spaces are being used. And I think that's true of universities as well, is what they're talking about themselves and then going and experiencing it. So that's my embodied research angle that I'll put on this.
Yeah, no, I think, and this is kind of a plague that bedevils kind of reporting and a lot of writing just about higher ed right now is it's either by people who haven't set foot on a campus in 20 years, but they've read some stuff about it. So they're imposing a narrative, or they're responding to a narrative that's been kind of created or exists kind of out there. Or they're doing kind of shoe leather reporting, like where they're going to a campus and they're interviewing people, but they're not really spending a time and thinking about kind of what the campus itself is telling people, the way that people are interacting and the kind of the mundane activities that can really describe a school, right? And that the structures can tell us, but also the way that people interact with spaces. Like you said, like if somebody is saying like, oh, faculty and students don't really get along and there's a real disconnect and stuff like that, but then you go into a space and you see them interacting all the time, like you got to do something with that, like because there's a disconnect there. And so that's a really kind of important facet of research. One of the things that I did want to ask you though is that, like, this is sort of related to that, it's about constructive narratives, is like how much of this do you think is specific to Detroit? Because I think that's something that, we've been kind of thinking about a little bit, is like, we're talking about Wayne State just as this example, but like, what about a place like a public university that's in a more rural space? Like, do you think these same stories interact? Like, and I'm struggling thinking about kind of the medieval analogy, like, because it's not going to have the same types of pressures on it. Like, they'll be similar, but they'll be a little bit different. And maybe that's just, we shouldn't be looking for a one-size-fits-all thing, but that is kind of a thing that's kind of in the back of my mind as we're pursuing this facet of research.
Yeah, and again, I think it's a lot easier to see in an urban environment because it is all compact and right on top of each other.
Yeah.
But I think in any college town, you have, and in any place there's a university, you have town-gown, right?
Sure, of course.
Town-gown relations. And I think that's the nearest parallel here. And we see, at Virginia Tech, expansion, again, current environment, enrollment pressures, trying to grow ourselves into some more resources, and then the pressures that puts on the surrounding community. So in a lot of spaces, colleges have a narrative of, we are part of the community, we are all one. And then when they want to do something like expand, and maybe they're getting pushback from the town, then it's like, well, sucks for you. We're the university. We got to do what we got to do, and then the narrative is no longer, oh no, but we're all in this together. And, it is until it isn't. And I think that's going to become more amplified as pressures mount around enrollment.
Yeah, those narratives could be really situational, right? That the stories that they tell about kind of the identity of the university. And I'm thinking again of an analogy to the Middle Ages of these monasteries. One of my articles was about this one particular monastery, which is in southwestern France. It's a really lovely monastery. Well, it doesn't exist anymore because it was torn down during the Revolution. But it was the monastery of Charroux, which at various times was really engaged with the Dukes of Aquitaine, but also at the same time with the French king. And in the records that we have, both the histories about this, but also the diplomas, kind of the gifts or the records of gifts that were given to this monastery, in documents that are sitting right next to each other chronologically, it could do both things. Like one of these is like, no, we're a royal monastery. Like you can't say anything to us, Duke of Aquitaine. And then the next one is like the Duke of Aquitaine, who is of course the most important person that we have ever cared about in our entire lives, will help this. And then there'll be other times in which it's basically like, oh, Baron, you were so great, but I just want to remind you that we're the best monastery kind of in the world. And so like, I think we think of this as kind of new, but that's, I hope, one of the things that, not that this is just like the Middle Ages, of course, that's a silly thing to say that, but that these types of narratives are not new, or these types of ways of thinking about relations of power. That's one of the things that thinking about the European Middle Ages can kind of maybe help us better understand how these campuses or these universities kind of function.
And I think there's a piece of that too, which is we're throwing around this term university, this really broad term. Within a university, there's multiple colleges or schools, right?
Yes.
Who all have individual interests. And so your example of, buddying up with the king versus buddying up with the duke, you could have in a university one college doing just that, sending some narrative out into the world, and another college sending what could be pretty much the opposite narrative. And we're not good at wrangling that all the time, right?
Yeah.
So we don't speak always as a university.
Yeah.
So we have some complexity in the individual interests as well.
Yeah. I don't want to shock any of our listeners, but the College of Engineering and the College of Liberal Arts within the same university are not always on the same page. That is a true statement. So
Yep. Mm-hmm.
My guest is nodding, so just to vocalize that.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody can see that
A
yet.
podcast nod. Yes.
You do have to say
They
that.
are not.
All right. We are unfortunately kind of running towards the end of our time, though. I think there's much more about kind of medieval Detroit I would love to talk about. I think there's the architecture of Detroit itself, which has kind of a lot of medieval elements, especially kind of in the heyday, the 20s, 30s, and stuff like that. I would love to talk more about that at some point, too. But, we'll kind of leave it at that. We'll have to wait for our paper. We actually have to write the paper that we're going to present.
We just wrote it. We just talked through it. I have
just talked
ideas.
through it. We're just going to transcribe this, and we're going to read it at the conference. So maybe we'll have to cut it down a little bit to 20 minutes, but there you go. All right, Rachel, thank you so much for coming on. It is a delight. I will probably see you later today, I would assume. But if people want to learn more about you or your work, do you want to direct them towards anything online so they can learn more about Detroit or kind of built spaces, narratives, anything like that?
Off the top of my head, I don't have a lot of publications out there, early scholar still, but I did mention the Rebecca Kinney book, Beautiful Wasteland, which is just a really accessible, interesting book about the more recent history of Detroit, but with the whole background. I'll also put a plug in for, it's called A People's Atlas of Detroit. And Andy Newman, who's a faculty member at Wayne State, kind of led this edited volume that involved community members. And it's just a really fascinating overview of different angles of the history of Detroit. So A People's Atlas of Detroit would be a great read. And I'm working on in a sort of new direction. I'm working on a book on campus environments and a lot of the things we just talked about around narratives and space with a colleague in the School of Education here around higher education campus environment. So hopefully forthcoming in the future, depending on academic publishing timelines. But
yeah, that's a great thing about academic forthcoming is 5 years next month. Same thing. Forthcoming. Yeah, exactly. All right. So it'll be there. All right, Rachel, again, thank you so much for joining us. And I would be delighted if you were to join me again, if I haven't scared you off. I don't really know how to end this episode, so I'm just going to say thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you enjoyed a little bit about Neomedieval Detroit. Be on the lookout. Hopefully we will be publishing that, or at least there'll be a little bit more information about that soon. Thank you again, everybody, once more for listening to this episode of American Medieval, and we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, a proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiaffini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.